Good morning, bonjour à tous. Je suis Charlie Angus. Wache, Kwe, we're on here on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I'm here this morning with Gil McGowan of the Alberta Federation of Labour. Over the last year, we have been working closely with the union movement across Canada and in particularly with the energy workers in the West on pushing this government to get serious about making commitments in a clean tech future. Alberta energy workers have the skills and the know-how to make this happen, and they want to be at the table. According to the International Energy Agency, for the first time, clean tech investments are almost double what it is in oil and gas. If Canada doesn't start to make a serious commitment to move forward, we are going to be left with stranded assets and communities left out. The New York Times this morning is reporting an unprecedented jump in clean tech energy and battery plant production within 9 months of Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act coming into law, and Canada risks being left behind unless we move decisively. In the recent federal budget, we did see some very impressive promises for clean tech, but those promises are just words unless there's the legislative tools to ensure that this is a worker-focused transformation that is not going to leave communities behind. We are calling for a number of elements that have to be in this legislation. The Sustainable Jobs Council must include representation from labor. Labor has to be at the table. We want clear definition of the role, mandate, reporting requirements of the Sustainable Jobs Secretariat. It's a great sounding word. What is it? And how do we ensure that investments that are being offered will come with the strings attached, that will have involvement from labor, from Indigenous communities, and from the regions of Canada to make sure that we benefit and that the expertise that is being brought forward through the energy workers are able to help direct this transformation of the global economy. We have one chance to do this right, and we cannot fail. Le monde fait face à une crise climatique, mais en même temps, il y a une transformation de l'économie énergétique mondiale. C'est nécessaire pour le Canada de jouer un rôle important dans la transformation mondiale vers l'énergie durable. Les travailleurs de l'énergie de l'Ouest sont prêts de saisir l'occasion. Je suis ici ce matin avec Gil McGowan, président de la Fédération du travail de l'Alberta. Les travailleurs d'Alberta demandent à ce gouvernement de mettre en place les législations nécessaires pour garantir que les investissements dans l'énergie propre profiteront aux communautés et aux travailleurs. Les travailleurs de l'énergie veulent être à la table de décision. Ils ont l'expertise pour faire de la transformation une réalité et ils ont le droit de protéger les intérêts des travailleurs et des régions du Canada. I'll turn it over to Gil McGowan.
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks for joining us this morning. On Monday, we narrowly elected or re-elected a climate change denying government in Alberta. This isn't just bad news for the environment, it's also bad news for the Alberta economy and for Alberta workers. It's bad news for workers and the economy because change is coming whether we like it or not. We can either be prepared for that change or we can be run over by it. The UCP, under our Premier Daniel Smith, unfortunately is choosing the latter. They're choosing to stick their heads in the sand. They're choosing denial over preparation. They're choosing to hold our province back while the world moves forward. And all Albertans, including Alberta workers, will pay a price. But it doesn't have to be that way. The world is in the early stages of what can only be described as the biggest economic paradigm shift since the Industrial Revolution. That shift is happening because citizens, businesses, and governments around the world are increasingly recognizing that climate change is an existential threat to humanity. This realization is driving action. The vast majority of governments on the planet have committed to move towards a net zero economy, and industry is following suit with their investment decisions. Last summer, the Biden administration turbocharged this process by embracing a nationwide industrial policy aimed at pivoting the American economy towards new opportunities in the net zero economy. The key word for us is opportunities. The unfolding global energy transition has huge implications for oil and gas producing jurisdictions like my home province of Alberta, but it also presents unprecedented opportunities for investment, job creation, and continued prosperity. That's why the labor movement in Alberta, representing workers in both oil and gas-related construction and manufacturing, came together last fall to produce a blueprint for an alternative economy in Alberta. We called it Skating to Where the Puck is Going, and it outlined 6 priorities for changing the Alberta economy and pivoting towards continued prosperity in a changing world. First, in that report, we told anyone who would listen, including our provincial government and the federal government, that in this unfolding energy transition, the priority has to be jobs, not just labor market adjustment for people who might lose their jobs in this transition, but the creation of good jobs that will sustain families and communities. Second, we said that we had to put a priority on embracing the idea of industrial policy because change will not come just by itself. It has to be intentional. And that intention has to be embraced and supported by governments here in Canada at both the federal and provincial level. Third, we said our governments and our industry have to put their money where their mouth is. Fourth, we said that when it comes to providing assistance and incentives for industry to make this transition, governments have to attach strings to the money that they provide as incentives. And fifth, we said that this has to be a whole economy and whole a government effort, which is an important point because as we discovered with dealing with bureaucracy in Alberta and increasingly with our experiences with bureaucracy in government, there are too many silos that have to be broken down in order to make the change that needs to happen at the scale and the speed that it has to happen. And sixth and finally, we said that in order for the change that we're proposing to make sure that it improves lives for everyone, workers have to be at the table. Not just as an afterthought, we have to be there from the beginning. We have to participate in decision making to make sure that the changes don't just help business, but they actually help the working people who are going to be at the front of this change. This morning, I just want to say that my interactions on behalf of our workers in Alberta have been constructive with the federal government. Over the last year and a half, we've had very productive discussions with key ministers, including Minister Wilkinson in Natural Resources, Minister O'Regan in Labour, and also Minister Freeland, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. They have met with us in good faith. They have taken our recommendations seriously, and I'm very pleased to say that a lot of the work that we set out to do with the federal government has been done. Specifically, when we came to them last year and said that we needed the government to embrace the idea of transition with a focus on jobs as opposed to labor market adjustment, they accepted that recommendation. So their priority is creating new jobs and seizing new opportunities to create new prosperity as opposed to just trying to pick up the pieces as change unfolds. Second, they embraced our notion that we should be embracing industrial policy as the goal to help facilitate this change. And then third, we asked that they put their money where their mouth is. And that's what we saw in the fall economic statement and in the recent budget. They earmarked $15 billion for incentives over the next 5 years that will help diversify the Canadian economy, especially the provincial economy in Alberta. And that money is going to escalate to about $80 billion over 10 years. What we asked them to do from the unions in Alberta representing workers in oil and gas related construction, and oil and gas manufacturing, we said that we had to match the American government's ambition in terms of size and scale of their incentives. And with what was announced in the federal budget, we feel satisfied that they've done that. The fourth thing that they've done in good faith is listen to our suggestions on attaching strings to that money specifically in order for companies to benefit from the full amount of the incentives. They have to, they've agreed to what we call labor conditions. So they, in order to get the full measure of the incentives, they have to pay a prevailing wage, which we're working with the federal government in good faith on to define what a prevailing wage is. And they also made a big commitment to make sure that we're training apprentices for the future of our trades. The work that's yet to be done, and that's why I'm in Ottawa today, has to do with the sustainable jobs legislation that the federal government has promised and which we are told will be introduced sometime in the next couple of weeks. We want, we've got the political commitment, we've got money on the table. Now we need a legislative framework to make sure that the job actually gets done. And so yesterday and today I've been meeting with senior bureaucrats and with political actors in the federal government to talk about what we in the Alberta Labour Movement would like to see in the sustainable jobs legislation. And basically that, what we're hoping is to see the remainder of our priorities. We've checked off a number of our priorities on our list, but what hasn't yet been seen is a framework that will facilitate a whole government effort to support investment and job creation in these new opportunities. So we need legislation that will make sure that we can break down these barriers between departments to make sure that ideas and money are flowing to where they need to go. And then we also need a labor seat at the table. So we need to create a framework for decision making to make sure that this work gets done. And we've made it clear that this transition can only happen with working people, especially workers in the most affected sectors, participating in the decision-making process. And that means from the get-go, not as an afterthought after decisions have already been made. As I said, we're very pleased with the discussions that we've had so far. The federal government is coming to the table to meet with us in goodwill, and we're confident that the legislation, when it's introduced, will be a big step towards the direction that we hope to see our country moving in terms of seizing the opportunities that are presenting themselves in as we pivot towards a net zero economy. I'm going to wrap up this morning by telling you what I'm worried about. With the re-election of a UCP government in Alberta, what I'm, as a representative for working people in our province, including people in oil and gas related construction, and oil and gas related manufacturing, I'm frankly terrified that our provincial government will make it more difficult for us to seize the opportunities that are in front of us in the unfolding global economy. And I'm also worried that they will hold us back so that we fail to seize the opportunities that are in front of us. And I say that because the UCP over the last 3 years, and especially in the lead up to our recent provincial election, has chosen to look at the issue of the global energy transition not as an issue about defending the public interest, but through a political lens, and they've tried to politicize a discussion that really should be about the public interest. So instead of preparing our economy and supporting incentives that will support job creation and allow us to prosper in a changing world, they've chosen to play politics. And one of the reasons I've flown here the day after our provincial election is because Alberta needs to engage with all partners at all levels, including the federal government, including business, to make sure that we don't get left behind as the global economy transforms. As I've said many times, this change is happening whether we like it or not. We can choose to prepare for it and prosper, or we can stick our heads in the sand and be left behind. You know, and in order to make sure that that doesn't happen, in order to ensure that we actually seize these opportunities for prosperity that are in front of us, our provincial government has to engage with all the relevant partners. That includes the federal government. And so if they're not going to do that important work, then that will fall to other Albertans, including those of us in Labour, those of us and our counterparts in business in Alberta. We'll have to have the conversations that our provincial government should be having. And if that's not my first preference, but I know that there are many Albertans of goodwill in the labour movement, in the business community, who will be engaging with the federal government on these important discussions, even if our provincial government refuses to. So with that, I'll just wrap up, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
This is maybe a stupid question, but you're talking about the whole of government approach, breaking down barriers. This is one of the big things you want to see in the legislation. Can you just explain, like I'm five, of what you're talking about? What is this? What's wrong with sort of the system now around this, and exactly what needs to change? Just it's maybe a stupid question, but just
well, it's
to
not
really
a stupid question. Well, I'm going to answer this in two ways. First, I'm going to refer to some of the experience that we had under the previous Alberta government. You know, between 2015 and 2019, the New Democrats under Premier Rachel Notley were in charge in Alberta, and they responded to some of the concerns that we had raised in the labour movement about diversification and support for workers who are losing their jobs as a result of the coal phase out. And it became very clear to us that in order to get the kind of support that we needed from the provincial government at the time, we had to be talking to the right people. So when they announced the coal phase out, it was under the Environment Department, and you know, jobs were being phased out, and a lot of those people were our members, and we ended up talking with people in the Environment Department who knew nothing about labor policy. And so it became very clear to us that when dealing with government, you got to talk to the right people for the challenge at hand, right? And so, you know, that's why I say you got to break down barriers between departments, and that's true at the federal level as well. So, you know, right now, the discussions on the sustainable jobs legislation are being led by the Natural Resources Minister, which is fine, but his department is not specialist in many of the other areas that we feel very strongly need to be part of the discussion. So, for example, the Labour Department has to be involved in the discussion because of their responsibility for labour markets. The Department of Employment and Skills Development has to be involved because of their responsibility for training, and then departments like industry have to be involved, and certainly the finance department needs to be involved. So that's why I say, and traditionally governments, whether it's provincial or federal level, don't have a great track record of always talking across silos. And that's why some kind of framework needs to be established in this legislation. I think there's an opportunity to do this with this legislation, to create a framework that will facilitate the discussions that need to happen between these different departments. And I don't want to cast dispersions. You know, the people who work in each of these departments do great work, but because we're talking about such a big change over such a short period of time, and we're talking about, you know, the need to seize these opportunities and not be left behind, we can't let these silos and the bureaucracy stand in the way of us doing what needs to be done. So that's why I'm hoping that this legislation will create a framework that will allow the kind of you know, communication, cross-pollination, and collaboration that's necessary between these different departments.
So if I understand,
I think they get it, and you know, like in the conversations that I've been having with people from natural resources, labor, finance, industry, I think they understand that the status quo and the silos that exist in in and between the departments, there needs to be something done to break down those barriers in order for us to adequately prepare for the challenges in front of us.
Recently, we've heard it was more out east in the Maritimes with tidal energy projects, but there was some concerns that federal regulations and sort of the system of approving certain projects was too onerous for the seize the moment speed imperatives that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Do you feel like in this area it's a similar thing, that the culture of government, and it's maybe what you're talking about now, that the pace at which they make decisions is not appropriate for the task at hand or the climate crisis at hand and what needs to happen?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that question, because during those 4 years when the New Democrats were in power in Alberta between 2015 and 2019, one of the things that Premier Notley did at the time was establish what they called the Energy Diversification Advisory Committee, which was a joint labor business advisory committee that put together recommendations about diversification in the Alberta economy. I was actually chosen as the labor co-chair, and there was another co-chair from business. And in our final report, one of the things that we suggested was an effort to speed the regulatory approval process for diversification projects. So that's something that you've heard from the business community. It's something that we in Labour support. There are huge opportunities that are out there, but we are competing with other jurisdictions, including the United States south of the border. So if we don't put money on the table, if we don't speed the regulatory process for projects that can create jobs and get us to where we want to go in terms of diversification, we'll fall behind, right? So it makes I don't know if it sounds like it's a surprise coming from the president of the Alberta Federation of Labour, but on this issue about speeding the regulatory process, we agree with our counterparts in business. In fact, one of the things that I repeat over and over again when I'm meeting with government officials, both at the provincial and federal level, is that when it comes to diversification in the Alberta economy, in order to pivot and seize opportunities in the net zero economy, the labour movement in our province is in many respects on the same page as the business community. And in my remarks, I mentioned that we had come together through the Federation of Labour with our energy, construction and manufacturing unions to produce an economic blueprint. We called it Skating to Where the Puck is Going, borrowing that famous phrase from Wayne Gretzky. And we released that last fall. But almost at the same time, similar reports were being released by the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, the Business Council of Alberta, and in the broad strokes, they were very similar. So even though we've just seen the re-election of a government that is essentially a climate-denying government, a government that refuses to have serious conversations about diversification, and a government that continues to stick its head in the sand in terms of seizing these opportunities for investment and job creation in the new economy. When people think of Alberta, they think of Daniel Smith and the UCP and their denialism. But the reality is that in Alberta right now, there's this amazing consensus that's being reached outside of the political sphere by people in business, people in labor, people in the broader community. We understand that change is coming, and that we need to prepare for it or run the risk of being left behind. That's what I'm hearing from my counterparts in unions in Alberta. It's what I'm hearing from business organizations, not incidentally, including the big oil sands companies represented through organizations like the Pathways Alliance. I guess that's one of the things I would encourage Canadians to understand, is that when it comes to this unfolding global energy transition and the opportunities it presents, our currently re-elected UCP government is not actually representative of all Albertans. They've chosen to politicize these issues and demonize anyone who talks about preparing for transition, but the reality is that most Albertans are way ahead of our government on these important issues.
I've got a question for both of you, if that's all right. Just going back a bit to Budget 2023, we're talking about the labour requirements that were attached to those investment tax credits. This is my read, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that would only apply to, you know, the construction phase, not necessarily ongoing manufacturing and whatnot. How, I don't know, I guess, how do you assess the fact that that wasn't part of the package? Like, was that a big loss to, you know, unions and the NDP both? How do, and like, where do we go from there in terms of maybe attaching more strings to future programs outside of the just transition legislation or sustainable jobs?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and it is an issue that we raised quite vigorously with the federal government, and maybe just for the benefit of those who are watching, when the federal Liberals, let me put it, when the federal government introduced the budget for 2023 last year, they made a commitment to $15 billion in incentives to support investment in clean tech, hydrogen, carbon capture and sequestration, and they attached what they described as labor conditions to all of those investment incentives. And so in order to get the full benefit of those incentives, companies would have to commit to paying a prevailing wage, which is, you know, still being defined. And so we're working hard with finance officials to get a definition of prevailing wage that actually, you know, pulls as many people up as possible. And then they also have, in order to qualify for the full benefit of the incentives, they have to commit to training the next generation of tradespeople, which is important because a lot of big construction companies, especially the non-union companies, do not actually take on apprentices. They choose instead to poach from companies that do, who in most cases are unionized. And so that puts the unionized companies at a disadvantage, even though they play this hugely important role in terms of training the next generation. So we in the labor movement, we lobbied for those labor conditions. We got them, and we're very pleased. But as you said in your question, the way that they've been designed is that the labor conditions only apply to the construction phase of these new projects and not the ongoing operation of these facilities. And so what we said during the lead up to the federal budget was that we wanted to see similar conditions attached to all phases of these projects, including once they went into operation. So whether it's, you know, like a manufacturing facility or you know, or an oil and gas facility, we said that there should be conditions if they're going to get continued ongoing public support that would require that they pay a prevailing wage, hire apprentices, because this is not just an issue for the construction sector. So we were disappointed that they didn't extend the labor conditions beyond the construction sector. But this is still a live issue. And so we in the labor movement, through groups like the Alberta Federation of Labour, through our individual unions, through the Canadian Labour Congress, we're still bringing this conversation to the federal government. They haven't said no, but they haven't said yes. But they're still meeting with us to have these discussions. So we're hoping that we'll find a way to make sure that every company that gets public money to incent their projects will be required to pay their workers a decent wage, a prevailing wage, that they'll have requirements on training, and that these requirements will go beyond construction, that will apply to the companies who are getting these incentives, regardless of what stage of development they're at.
The issue of labor commitments, apprenticeship commitments, goes to the very heart of the negotiations that began on the SACA agreement between the Liberals and the Democrats, because we did point out to the government, you know, the Prime Minister goes to COP26, makes all these big announcements, and Canada misses every single climate target they've ever made. Joe Biden goes to COP26 and says he's going to create a new economy based on good paying union jobs. And we said to the Liberals, we never heard that language from you guys. We've never heard that you are committed not just to meeting your global targets, but that you're looking to reassure Canadians that they are going to be part of a new economy. And that industrial policy vision was a huge hurdle. I mean, I'm going to say our Liberal friends are way outside their comfort zone on this. And we're going to get them a little further outside their comfort zone, because this is really important stuff. So when we heard that they were going to put labor conditions, that was really good. When they said they were going to put apprenticeships, that was also a good signal. But this is not over. This is why when we set up the Secretariat and the Jobs Partnership Council, Labour has to be at the table, so that we know that this isn't just nice words that ends up getting, you know, projects offshored. This is words that are put into reality, and that reality is about creating a new energy economy where families are going to be able to know that there's a take-home pay at the end of the day, that there's going to be apprenticeships, that there's a better future for our communities. That's what the government has to reassure Canadian communities, regions, and workers for. So, yeah, as Gil says, this fight's far from done. We will say what we've got is we've got a flag in the field. Now we got to get to the past the finish line.
And what are the major sticking points in those discussions? Because I understand getting the construction requirements in first. That's going to be what's coming up first. I guess, yeah. Where's the resistance coming from during those talks?
I think Gil pointed out initially, it's really, again, outside the comfort zone of government to come up with legislation that is cross departments. And getting them to understand, you can't just put legislation in and say you're going to transform the Canadian economy. That's ridiculous. That's a recipe for failure. And we've unfortunately seen a lot of failure. We saw what happened in the cod fishery. I come from Northern Ontario. I don't know how many of my mining communities have gone down with nothing except a little manpower center and a twilight economy. We're talking about a crisis. We're talking about an opportunity. And so getting government to understand all the way up through the Prime Minister's office and the PCO that this is not just going to be Minister Wilkinson over at NRCan, but this is going to be the Labour Minister. This is going to be environmental policy. This is going to be ESDC. We need them all working together, and we need them working with Labour and communities. So there's a number of sticking points. I'm hopeful that when the legislation comes, we're going to see some areas of real transformation. This Sustainable Jobs Secretariat, what is it? What does it do? What is its mandate? What are the accountability mechanisms? What is the data that's being collected? Because if we don't have good data on where the jobs are, on where the opportunities, or where the losses are, we've got nothing. So we need language there that's very clear. On the Jobs Partnership Council, we want to know that there's going to be, again, co-chairs, and that Labour is one of those co-chairs, and that the government's not taking this as just some, little desk that's going to be in the minister's back office, but this is actually going to have a mandate to instruct government on where to go. So those are two key areas. There's a number of things on the Sustainable Jobs Plan. Nice words, talk about training, talk about upskilling. What is that going to look like, and how is it going to affect people in different parts of the country? Because the transformation is happening in various locales, in very different speeds right now. I think one of the reasons we work so closely with the Alberta Federation of Labour is there's nothing theoretical about this in Alberta. This is what's happening on the ground. So their expertise is really, really important. So we're optimistic we can get there, but we're moving a mountain. And we have to get that mountain moved very quickly in order to start catching up to where the Americans have already just gone way beyond what anybody thought could have been done. So the Americans have an all-of-government approach. We have to at least match that.
No question on
Maybe just one more quick one. If we can, don't want to take up your whole day here, but my understanding is in previous months, the NDP and maybe even the AFL was quite involved in discussing this with the government, even in the tent, if that's the right metaphor, in terms of crafting this. Has it been similar with the legislation? And like, how close are the talks around this? How involved are you guys?
I've been called a pain in the ass. I think that's a pretty good thing to be called. Let's just say we're about that far off them on their backs every day, all day into the evening, because we got to get this right, and we got one shot at it. So they're constructive. Let's say I would say they're constructive, but we really have to deliver. And there's going to be a lot of questions when this legislation comes forward, and we want to be able to answer those questions.